The Johnson family lived in the bustling city of Chicago. The family consisted of 5 members: Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, their eldest daughter Emily, their middle child David, and the youngest, Sophie. The Johnsons were a close-knit family who enjoyed spending time together, especially during the summer vacations when they could escape the daily grind of city life. It was the summer of 2023, and the Johnsons decided to take a much-needed vacation. They chose a remote cabin near Cedar Lake, a picturesque location nestled in the dense forests of Wisconsin. The tranquil surroundings promised a peaceful retreat away from the city's hustle and bustle. They packed their bags with enthusiasm, anticipating a week of relaxation and adventure. Upon arriving at the cabin, the family was charmed by its rustic beauty. The wooden structure stood near the edge of the lake, surrounded by towering pine trees. The air was fresh and filled with the scent of pine needles. Emily, being 17, was excited to explore the area and took her younger siblings, David, 14, and Sophie, 10, on a hike.
As the children wandered through the forest, they came across an old abandoned house hidden among the trees. It was a dilapidated structure with broken windows and a door hanging off its hinges. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to explore the house. Inside, the air was musty, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. Old furniture lay scattered around, covered in dust. As they ventured further, Emily found an old diary on a dusty table. She opened it and started reading aloud. The diary belonged to a girl named Mary, who lived there in the 1920s. Her last entry spoke of strange noises at night and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Feeling uneasy, the siblings left the house and returned to the cabin. That night, as they gathered around the fireplace, Emily shared the story with their parents. Mr. Johnson dismissed it as nonsense, but Mrs. Johnson looked worried. She had always been sensitive to such things. The first night in the cabin was peaceful, but things began to change the next day. Emily started hearing whispers in the woods, and David saw shadows moving outside the cabin. Sophie complained of nightmares about a girl crying for help. One evening, Mrs. Johnson found Emily in a trance-like state staring at the lake. When she snapped out of it, Emily couldn't remember what had happened. That night, the family was awoken by loud banging on the walls of the cabin. Mr. Johnson grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate, but found nothing. The next day, the family decided to leave, but their car wouldn't start. With no cell service, they were trapped. Desperation set in, and Mr. Johnson decided to hike to the nearest town for help, leaving the rest of the family at the cabin. As night fell, the haunting intensified. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows became more pronounced. Emily found herself drawn to the lake again, and this time Sophie followed her. Mrs. Johnson, realizing they were gone, rushed out to find them standing at the water's edge. Emily was mumbling incoherently, and Sophie was crying. Mrs. Johnson managed to drag them back to the cabin, but Emily's condition worsened. She kept repeating the name Mary and spoke of a girl trapped in the lake. With Mr. Johnson still not back, Mrs. Johnson decided to confront whatever was haunting them. She gathered her children and headed back to the abandoned house. In the diary, she found a passage about a ritual to appease the spirits. Desperate, she decided to perform it. As they followed the instructions, the air grew colder and the shadows seemed to close in on them. The ritual required them to place the diary in the lake and say a prayer. As they did, a piercing scream echoed through the forest, and the shadows vanished. The next morning, Mr. Johnson returned with help. The family left the cabin and never looked back. Emily recovered, but the experience left a mark on them all. They later learned that the girl, Mary, had drowned in the lake under mysterious circumstances, and her spirit had been trapped there ever since. The Johnsons never spoke of the incident again, but they knew one thing for sure. Some places are haunted by more than just memories. The aftermath of the vacation left the Johnson family shaken. Back in Chicago, Emily had frequent nightmares and found it hard to focus on her studies. She often felt as if someone was watching her, especially at night. Sophie, once cheerful and full of energy, became quiet and withdrawn. David, too, found it hard to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over their family. Mrs. Johnson, unable to ignore the lingering fear, sought help from a local historian to uncover more about Cedar Lake and the mysterious Mary. She discovered that Mary had been a lonely child, often seen playing by the lake. Her disappearance had been sudden, and her body was never found. The diary Emily found was believed to have been lost with Mary, adding to the mystery of how it ended up in the abandoned house. Despite their efforts to move on, the Johnson family felt a lingering presence. One night, Emily woke up to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was a girl, drenched in water, her eyes wide with terror. Emily screamed, waking the entire household. Mr. Johnson rushed in but found nothing. This incident prompted the Johnsons to seek the help of a paranormal investigator. The investigator, Mr. Thompson, listened intently to their story. He agreed to visit the cabin and perform a thorough investigation. When he returned, he revealed chilling findings. The land around Cedar Lake was known to be haunted by restless spirits, particularly those who had met tragic ends. Mr. Thompson suggested a cleansing ritual for their home in Chicago to rid them of any lingering spirits that might have followed them. The ritual was performed, and gradually, the strange occurrences lessened. The family began to regain a sense of normalcy, though the memory of Cedar Lake haunted them. Emily, determined to put the past behind her, focused on her studies and decided to research more about paranormal activities. She wrote a detailed account of their experience, which later became an article in a local magazine. Her story captivated many readers and brought awareness to the mysteries surrounding Cedar Lake. Years passed, and the Johnsons rarely spoke of their haunted vacation. The cabin at Cedar Lake remained abandoned, a silent witness to the horrors the family had endured. Occasionally, whispers of Mary's ghost reached them through locals who had heard the tales. But the Johnsons, now wiser and more cautious, stayed far away from Cedar Lake. Their story served as a stark reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The Johnsons learned that the past could reach out in the most unexpected ways, leaving an indelible mark on those who dare to uncover its mysteries.